Let me read to you a passage from the 12th chapter of St. Mark's Gospel, verses 38 to 44. It's the Gospel for Saturday of the 9th week in Ordinary Time. St. Mark writes, "As he taught, Jesus said, 'Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. Such men will be punished most severely.' Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a fraction of a penny. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, 'I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on.'" That's Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 44. What does it suggest to us? Well, it speaks of the influence of example. What do I mean? Well, I remember one married couple whom I knew particularly well. The husband spoke with a very ordinary accent of his country, while the wife spoke with a very polished accent. They had their first child, and I was struck with the accent of that child as he learnt to speak. He developed a polished accent, in clear imitation of his mother. This was not surprising, of course, but it did remind me of the great influence of example, especially in very early years. As that child began to have contact with other children, his accent began to change. Then, when the child went to school, after some time, his accent became the ordinary accent of the society around him, very much like that of his father. The accent of the child's speech was an indicator of the influence on him of the example of those around him. Now, the child's mother was not especially religious. She went to church regularly, but God was not a vividly appreciated reality in her life. That child grew up without being especially religious either. In 1873, a child was born into a large family, a child by the name of Therese Martin, in France. She had many sisters, and her parents were deeply religious. When she was 15, she entered the Carmelite monastery of Lisieux, lived the next 9 years of heroic fidelity to ordinary everyday duties, and died at the age of 24. Less than 30 years later, she was canonized as saint by Pope Pius XI, who declared her to be the star of his pontificate. In 1997, Pope John Paul II declared her to be a doctor of the Church because of the extraordinary value of her brief and simple writings. What is especially manifest in her writings is her profound veneration for the sanctity of her parents. Her parents, Louis and Zélie Martin, set her on the path of holiness. In fact, she regarded them as saints, and this has been vindicated by the Church, for they were beatified by the Church in October 2008. Imagine Therese being born into a non-Christian family, or even of atheistic parents. Her life would have been entirely different. It indicates to us the powerful effect of example, for good or for ill. In our Gospel today that I read earlier, our Lord warns his listeners against the scribes. The chapter in which this is situated contains his exposure of the religious leaders, his defeat of the representatives of the Pharisees and the Herodians, his refutation of the Sadducees, his illuminating response to a question from one of the scribes, and his teaching on the Messiah as referred to in one of the Psalms. He then tells his audience to beware of the scribes and the teachers of the law. He is obviously referring especially to the example they were giving of the practice of religion. As we heard, watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for a show they make lengthy prayers. Such men will be punished most severely. So they drew honor to themselves by their prominence and ostentatious observance of the practice of religion, and at the same time they practiced serious injustice. They devour the homes of widows, we heard. Perhaps what was involved here was an insidious influence they exerted on widows to bequeath to them their properties. We may imagine many widows of Jewish society living a life of piety, and it being suggested to them that it would be a holy thing to leave their property to the religious leaders of the nation, such as the scribes and the teachers of the law. We read elsewhere in the Gospel that when Jesus was warning against the attachment to wealth, the leaders laughed at him because they loved riches. They scoffed at his doctrine because they regarded riches as a sign of God's favor. When Christ lay hanging on the cross, his degradation showed them that he was not in the favor of God. Wealth vindicated them in society, and they encouraged, so it seems from our Lord's remark, widows to leave their property to them. They were proud and also unjust. Our Lord warns his hearers against the example of their religion. We ought to be very canny in respect to the example of those around us. The example for the Christian is Jesus Christ. The Christian has a living exemplar, and the record of his ways is before us in the Gospel. I am the way, the truth, and the life, he said. St. Paul, in writing to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, verse 1, exhorted them to imitate him as he imitated Christ. Together with Christ, the Church proposes for us the example of those who have heroically and correctly imitated him. Those imitators of Jesus Christ are given to us especially, though not only, in the canonized saints, such as Therese of Lisieux and her holy parents. Let us then live in Jesus Christ, making him our pattern, our exemplar, all our days.